Okay, so I guess we're going to get started. Hello, everyone. Greetings from San Francisco. I'm Philip Yun, President and CEO of World Affairs, and I'm really pleased to welcome you all to one more of our pop-up programs. As we have in the past, we again are pulling together an informal, very quick, impromptu discussion with a noted expert to address a particularly pressing issue. And boy, do we know that there are a bunch of them right now. And so to make sure that you are where you want to be today, I'm really pleased to host you for a conversation with well-known national security expert and a very good friend of mine, Joe Cirincione. And we're going to talk in part about Ukraine, and we're going to take a deeper dive into Putin's really disconcerting decision to put Russian nuclear forces on a higher state of alert. For those of you who know Joe, Joe is currently a distinguished fellow at the Quincy Institute in Washington, D.C. He's a national security analyst and an author with over 35 years of experience. He's the author of 7 books, including Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It's Too Late, and Bomb Scare, the history and future of nuclear weapons. In fact, I was at Plowshares Fund when he was writing one of those books. Right. Joe has made a number and continues to make countless television appearances pretty much on every network you can find, and he has been incredibly busy the last couple of days. And on a personal note, as I've sort of alluded to, I've known Joe for 15, almost 20 years. He and I were partners together at Plowshares Fund. I don't think you're going to find anyone more articulate in describing to you what is going on in a clear way than Joe. So before we start, okay, Joe, welcome. Okay.
Thank you very much, Philip. It's wonderful to be here. It's great to see you, however distant.
Yes. And you're in Washington, right? No, you're in Maryland right now, but Washington.
Yeah, right outside the Washington border. I live in Tacoma Park, Maryland, right outside D.C.
Okay. Before we get started in the questions, I want to remind everyone about logistics. Joe and I are going to talk about 30 minutes or so. If you have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A, or and then we can go ahead and pick them up for you, or possibly, I'm not really sure how we're working this, maybe raising your hand if we can, but we'll go from there. Okay. So Joe, welcome.
Thank you, Philip.
Okay, so new things are happening every day on a day-to-day basis in Ukraine. Russian forces are bogged down, but they're slowly advancing. We see huge numbers. They surrounded a number of cities, superior firepower, men, but there's this will to fight when you compare the Ukrainians to the Russians, and the Ukrainians is huge. The Russians seem to be relatively small. So for some people, they're hoping. Yet, a lot of us are thinking that the worst is yet to come, because it appears Putin's going to pull out all the stops and it's just going to get bloodier. So, we'll allow people to ask maybe questions about tactics and where they're going, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about the strategic. And this past weekend, it seems that the world has shifted in ways that we could not have imagined even a week ago. I mean, Germany is rearming in a sense. Sweden and Finland, now who are always neutral, want to join NATO. Ukraine was not headed for NATO membership, but has asked for it formally. And even Switzerland is not neutral, is taking a side. So I wanted to get your reaction for all of us, really big picture, pivotal point in history, reactions to all of what's happened this past weekend and last week.
It's not too often that you can understand that you're at a hinge point in history, but this is one of them. This is it. This is one of the biggest geostrategic shifts we've seen in our lifetime. You have to go back to the collapse of the Berlin Wall to catch anything that was this unexpected. I mean, even though maybe it shouldn't have been, it caught almost everybody by surprise. That is developing in very unexpected ways. No one thought the Ukrainians could hold out for 3 days, let alone a week. And it has brought forth new alliances, new structures in international relations, and it could possibly bring the downfall of the largest, richest autocrat in the world, a man who has based the last 10 years on sort of building an axis of autocrats around the world, including in our country. So that you cannot overstate the geopolitical importance of this moment. Nobody knows how this is going to end. I mean, nobody knows how this is going to end. We're just starting to get some suggestions for diplomatic resolution to this crisis. Our colleague Tom Pickering just posted a very thoughtful piece yesterday at the Responsible Statecraft website, the website of the Quincy Institute, where I now am affiliated. And you're seeing,
and Tom Pickering is a former Undersecretary of State. He's a 4-time ambassador, and particularly to Russia, I believe, right?
right? Yes, exactly. So this is a guy who knows the world map quite well and the world leaders quite well. So you're just starting to see this, but it's all happening very quickly. It's happening before our eyes. And I'm so glad that you're giving us the opportunity to talk about these things. We all need to be talking about this, because it's not like there's a wise group of people in Washington that know what to do. There isn't. They're doing pretty well. We'll get into that in a second. But this is really going to involve the informed consent of the American people to shape our policies going forward.
So let's step back a little bit. I mean, it's kind of crazy, but when we look at what's happened, at what the result has been, all the things that Putin stated he was fearful of, of the West, he and thus because of that, he preemptively decides to act unilaterally for what he claims are legitimate security reasons. And if we assume that is the case, he in fact has created his own nightmares. I mean, by all accounts, Putin thought war was going to end quickly. It still remains to be seen, but it's definitely lasted longer than he anticipated. But was Putin's decision to invade simply a colossal miscalculation, or in your mind, is there something else here?
Yeah, let's tick through the two things, the changes that we're seeing, just to make sure we're not missing anything.
Yeah.
He part of what he wanted to do was invade Ukraine to make that part of his sphere of influence. And it was very clear from his speeches that this was just the beginning of his ambitions. He talked about bringing all the former Soviet republics back in, right? So clearly that is not going to happen. The opposite is happening. All those former Soviet, well, not all, the ones that are already in NATO are clearly, the Baltic states are clearly going. Ukraine is more aggressively pushing for membership in the EU, et cetera. Even Kazakhstan, a country where Putin just a few months ago saved that leader from mass protests. Kazakhstan has refused to send troops that Putin requested to go fight this battle. They refused to recognize the independence of the autonomous regions in the Donbass region that Putin declared at the beginning of this week. You're seeing countries that have been historically neutral now side with the Western alliance. Switzerland, you mentioned. Remember, Switzerland was neutral in World War II, in the war against the Nazis, And they are now lining up, seizing in a very real way, not just some kind of vote or a statement, seizing Russian assets in Switzerland, violating a century of safe haven for funds that you could reliably deposit in a bank in Zurich and know you could always get them. You can't get them now. You see instruments that are being developed that we've never done before. We have sanctioned the central bank of Russia. Now, the kinds of sanctions that we're now putting on Russia have been applied to North Korea, you know this well, to Iran, to Venezuela, but not to a country the size of Russia, not the 11th largest economy in the world, not a country with 6,000 nuclear weapons. This is actually a declaration of economic war. This has the potential to bring down the Russian state at this point. Russia can't open its stock market. This is the 4th day in a row it's been closed because they know if they open it up, it's going to crash. It's going to completely collapse. The ruble has already lost 1/3 of its value. So you're seeing all this. And as you mentioned, the new chancellor of Germany has just tripled Germany's defense budget, at least for this year. Germany spends about 53 billion euros a year. Chancellor Scholz has just announced a 100 billion euro defense package, okay? And for the first time in post-war history, is shipping weapons to a country in a fight, is shipping anti-tank weapons over to the Ukrainian forces. What's this going to mean on the other end? We don't know yet, but clearly what you're seeing is a stronger, more united Europe, a stronger, more united Western alliance, a real feeling among these countries that are resisting this, that this kind of war cannot stand. This kind of war cannot stand. You cannot allow this kind of warfare to continue in the 21st century, even though we've been allowing it. And this gets to the beginning of your question, then I'll stop and let you go. Why did Putin do this? Well, we should be familiar with this hubris. I've been struck by the parallels to our invasion of Iraq in 2003. I probably was the last person in Washington who thought that George W. Bush was not going to invade Iraq because it was so obviously stupid. It was such a dumb thing to do. But it showed me then that just because something is stupid doesn't mean a country won't do it. And we went in with the same kind of hubris. This was part of a geopolitical transformation that we wanted to bring about in the Middle East. We spent months building up the forces. In our case, we rallied international opinion in favor of the war, or tried to. And when we didn't get that approval, we invaded anyway, thinking that we could lead to a quick victory, which we did. In 3 weeks, we defeated the 5th largest army in the world, but then the occupation set in. And you know the rest of the story. Well, I think Putin, looking at that and looking at the history of wars over the last 20 years, may have thought that this is what great powers are allowed to do now. We're allowed to go into other countries under false claims that they possess nuclear weapons, which is what he claimed about Ukraine and we claimed about Iraq, and that the world would tolerate it. And there's an element of racism here, because I think the world did tolerate it when it was the United States and Russia killing large numbers of non-white people in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. But now we're talking about Europe. And it's not just racist, although that's an element there that you can see the acceptance of what 1 million Ukrainian immigrants coming into Europe compared dramatically to the policies on Syrian immigrants and Afghan immigrants. But it's also that this is their back door. This is right next door to them. And this is something that they feel cannot stand. So he thought it was going to be quick. Remember, he invaded Georgia in 5 days, in and out. And that's what he thought was going to happen. That is clearly bogged down. He's now shifting to the kind of warfare he waged in Chechnya and in Syria, bombardment of the center of cities, in trying to suppress the will to resist. But I just don't think it's going to work. The world has rallied around Ukraine like, I actually can't think of an historic parallel. Zelensky has become a global icon. And on all facets. It's not just at UN or international forum, it's on sports fields. When Ukrainian athletes are introduced into European soccer leagues, when they're announced, when they're coming as a sub, the entire stadium stands up and gives them an ovation. You can feel this. You can feel this. Apple has stopped selling products. Aeroflot, Russian airplanes are banned from European and US airspace now. If you're a Russian oligarch, you can't fly to the West anymore. This is, and it just goes on and on and on and on. So Putin is clearly overestimated. And one last point, I think you're seeing the impact of kleptocracies on the military. Corruption is rampant at every level in Russia, and the military, the supply to military forces is no exception to that. Why is that convoy bogged down? Clearly, there's equipment problems. Clearly, there's inadequate leadership problems. And you're seeing what happens when people try to just, make a buck at every level of the operation, including in the military forces that Putin himself might have thought were much more competent than they really are.
Okay, Joe, let's go to an area that you have done, incredible amount of thinking on as well. And it's nuclear weapons. Putin is signaling, he signaled a willingness to use nuclear weapons. Belarus has agreed to let nuclear weapons be placed on its soil. Let's step back really quickly for some context. I mean, you mentioned, Russia's got 6,000 weapons. How many does the United States have? And what does that mean? Those are big numbers for us. What give us a little context for what that kind of firepower is, and then we'll start off.
Okay. Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. It has just under 6,000 now. The accurate figure, according to the Federation of American Scientists, is at 5,700. We are a few hundred less at 5,200. I have to tell people that at these levels, numbers don't really matter. Both arsenals are many times more than you need to end all human life on this planet, destroy human civilization in an afternoon. So they've got the most, about 2,000 of those are in the operational stockpile that is available for use, and that's true for the United States as well. And about 1,000 of those are kept on high alert, ready to launch at any minute, and that's true for the United States as well.
Talk to me, because I think we're going to probably, possibly, I hope not, but we could be hearing more about tactical nukes. So explain to me and our audience what that is and why they're militarily significant and in what way.
Yeah. Tactical nukes are what we call battlefield nuclear weapons, weapons that are designed for battlefield use. We used to have thousands of them ourselves. Back when I started getting involved in this field, there was a NATO and a Warsaw Pact, and we thought we were conventionally outnumbered by the Warsaw Pact. So we had a doctrine of using nuclear weapons first to defeat a Warsaw Pact tank invasion of Europe. Now the shoe's on the other foot, and it's the Russians who now talk about the first use of nuclear weapons to defeat Western aggression. What it means, there's two areas that you're concerned about here. One is the intentional use of a nuclear weapon that's of shorter range, so airdropped or short-range rocket that could be used to achieve a military objective, defeating an armored force, for example. There's another strategy that might be more at play here, though, because it's unlikely Putin would do that. But the Russians have this doctrine called escalate to de-escalate. It's not clear how much this is integrated into Russian strategic thought, but it's been written about and talked about, and we think it's real, which is that if Russia should lose a conventional force or feel that they're on the verge of defeat, that they would use a relatively small nuclear weapon first. That is not a thermonuclear hydrogen bomb, but a smaller fission device that might be the size of the bomb we dropped on Hiroshima, or even smaller than that, to signal their resolve, to signal to the West that this was a serious situation, that Russia thought its existence itself was threatened, or the existence of the state was threatened, and that therefore they would, by using that nuclear weapon, convince the West to back off. So I raise this because if this war goes poorly for Putin, if he starts to feel that he is losing this war, it actually makes it more dangerous. It raises the risk that he might just decide to step it up and use a battlefield nuke, a local nuclear weapon, to signal his resolve to try to bring an end to the war. And so, that, of course, would be disastrous.
Yeah. So if he does something like that, I'm just sort of curious. What do you think what would happen? Give me a couple scenarios. I mean, maybe better back up before we alarm anyone. How worried should we be about this? How worried are you? And and the real danger. I mean, miscalculation clearly is something here for sure.
Yeah.
But what have you been thinking about or worried about?
The risk of nuclear use is low. It's unlikely to happen, but the possibility is not zero, and that should terrify us. And it's like so many other things about the war. It's not clear where this is going to go. And then you add to the mix our basic deterrence theories. What we've thought about nuclear weapons all these years, that they're supposed to prevent conventional wars in Europe. Well, it didn't prevent this. Right. It's supposed to allow us to intervene to stop an adversary's aggressive or coercive behavior. Well, it's not allowing us to intervene. In some ways, Putin's nuclear weapons are a shield for him that is allowing him to conduct this world. It's the opposite of what nuclear deterrence theory was all about. And finally, its posture, it's based on the idea that the leaders are rational And so you often hear a lot, if you do nuclear theory, a lot of game theory gets brought into this. What's the logical move? You do this. What's the other guy going to do? Well, is Putin rational? I do have a psychology degree from Boston College, but I don't feel I could diagnose the patient from this far away, but he certainly shows sign of megalomania. People I know and trust, like James Clapper, are saying this is not the Putin I knew. Condoleezza Rice raising similar concerns. Many people saying something strange is going on here. And we hear stories over recent days of him shouting and yelling and losing his temper a lot. Sounds a little like Donald Trump, right?
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
you start to worry that this is not a man who's making rational decisions. And, you could think of other megalomaniacal leaders who were losing wars and the kinds of things they do. So I do worry that at some point, if Putin thinks this is all going south, that he might lose power, that he might lose his life, he's going to turn to his generals and say, is Kyiv burning? He could bring it down. Now, again, this is a low probability event, but it is on the table. It is there. It is in the mix. And that should worry us all.
Well, I think that, we are victim to a lot of orthodoxy about nuclear weapons. I mean, really only two have actually been fired per se in battle. And we've dealt with situations over the past, 75 years or so that, involve the possibilities, right? And that's why I wanted to talk a little bit more and get some other, I want to talk a little bit more about what you were just talking about is the stability instability paradox, right?
Yeah.
That nuclear weapons create instability when we always thought it was mad, right? The mutual assured destruction made everything okay, right? And you were just talking, we're seeing this in Ukraine. So can you tell me a little bit more about the implications for that moving forward?
Well, I'm going to tell you that these implications are so profound that I think President Biden should pull back his nuclear posture review. For the last 5 months, the Pentagon has been preparing the nuclear posture review that most presidents conduct in their first year in office. Bill Clinton was the first one to do it. You might have been there when Clinton was doing that. And every president has followed suit since then. But this was already a deeply flawed document, and I write about this in an issue brief that I posted 2 weeks ago at the Quincy Institute. It was already deeply flawed. It was already too parochial, basically endorsing the programs and weapons that we already have. But now it is completely out of date. It has been overtaken by events. So President Biden should pull back that nuclear posture review. They just announced that they were pulling back the national security review that was going to be the overarching document for the what we call the NPR. Well, he should pull back the nuclear posture review as well and wait until after the Ukraine war to take a look at the terrain, to try to understand what just happened and its implications for our policies. And when they redo it, they should not have the Pentagon do it. There should be a National Security Council review that can take this global view in, that can start to take a look at the new economic instruments we've developed, the new unified alliance system we now have, and could be looking at the dangers that have been created here, the instability that nuclear weapons have produced, and thinking about ways to reduce them. Let me just give you one quick example of what I mean, and then I'll go back. For decades, people have been urging nuclear states to declare a no first use policy, meaning promising they would not be the first one to use nuclear weapons. Now, the United States didn't do that all during the Cold War for reasons we just discussed. They wanted to be the first to use them. But now we're in a situation where we have overwhelming conventional superiority. Our weapons are incredibly accurate, incredibly precise, incredibly powerful, and even coupled with cyber weapons, we don't need nuclear weapons for any conventional, any military mission. In fact, they harm us more than they aid our security. So we should be leading the way with a no first use policy. Biden should be saying it now. In order to reduce nuclear tensions, in order to reduce the prospect that Putin might use a nuclear weapon first, he should be declaring that US and NATO will never use a nuclear weapon first. We have no intentions of attacking another state with nuclear weapons, and that this should become the global norm now. That's an example of the kinds of things that the Pentagon has resisted all these years, that President Biden himself favors. He's made statements along these lines for many years. He's just not going to implement them. This might be a chance to revisit that, to make the strong national security case for why this improves our security, not weakens it.
So I think a lot of people are also going to be interested to see how how this connects in your mind to China and Taiwan. China and Taiwan are not, regionally your expertise, but, nuclear weapons are, and the whole theory about that. China is, starting to, recapitalize its nuclear weapons stockpile, gaining more, building more. Do you feel like that this will make conventional arms more likely on the Taiwan Straits?
Excellent question. I don't know the answer, and I'm going to ping pong this back to you because I want to know what you think about this. But I just had a conversation with Newt Gingrich about this yesterday.
Okay.
I did his podcast, and he and I don't agree about anything, but it turns out we agree on this. And we had a fascinating discussion on his podcast. And we talked about this. And to put this in perspective, China has about 300 nuclear weapons. So both the United States and Russia have about 6,000. China has 300. About 100 of those can reach us. In fact, more can reach you in San Francisco than can reach me in Washington, but about 100. Now, one nuclear weapon on one American city would be a catastrophe unlike anything we've experienced. 10 nuclear weapons on 10 cities would be a level of destruction beyond human experience. 100 nuclear weapons would end the United States as a functioning country and bring us back to the Stone Ages, plus having serious climate effects, putting dust and particulates in the air that would chill the earth, actually killing food crops around the world. Russia has 6,000 of these weapons. What the hell went wrong with our policies that we got to the stage 30 years after the Cold War and Russia's still allowed to have that number of weapons? Why didn't we pay more attention to George Shultz and Bill Perry and Sam Nunn and Henry Kissinger when they warned us back in 2007 that unless we moved aggressively to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons, we were going to be opening up a Pandora's box, a much more dangerous, psychologically disorienting, and economically expensive, as they put it, world. Well, we didn't do it when we had the chance, and here's where we are. So what's China doing? China doesn't really need to increase its nuclear stockpile, but it is. It's doing so to make sure it's survivable and can penetrate American defenses. But looking at their situation with Taiwan, they are watching this very closely. And I got to tell you, what's so interesting is that they're distancing themselves from Russia right now. Russia and China have a tacit alliance, nothing quite formal, but a lot of instruments of cooperation. China did not support Russia in the General Assembly yesterday.
Right.
Where only 4 countries lined up to support Russia. The rest of the countries, 141 voted to condemn Russia, 34 abstained. China was one of those. That's interesting. They are really hedging their bets on Russia now. And I hope that means that they might play a role in trying to encourage a diplomatic off-ramp, might be talking to Putin about ways that he can back out of this and still save face. Because I don't think they want this to go down as a precedent where a country uses military force to claim territory it believes it's rightfully theirs and is met with this kind of international economic, political, and diplomatic pushback. That was a long volley, but now over to you.
Well, I want to hear from you. I'll if we have time, I'll let people know what I'm thinking. But let me just remind our audience. Thanks, Joe. The audience, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A. I'll take a look at them and we'll ask them directly to Joe, as many as we have. So, Joe, let's go back again a little bit to endgame here. We talked a little bit about that. I heard there was something that someone was speculating on, that in some weird way, Putin is trying to create a new Iron Curtain to isolate himself from everything else. If that's ultimately where he wants to do, is create the security. Where do you see this all going? I mean, is he going, Macron basically said today after talking with Putin, he thought he wants to completely occupy the whole of Ukraine, right? And then you were just talking about there's this larger goal. What are you thinking about this?
Well,
Where's the end game?
I was against NATO enlargement when it began in the 1990s. I didn't think that we needed NATO anymore, or at least not, we shouldn't be expanding it. But, even so, at first it seemed like a kind of a reasonable step. And then it got a little more aggressive, and then we let the Baltic states in, and Eastern Europe started coming in. And all during that time, I was going to Russia and I was hearing from the Russians. And in the mid 90s, it was the far right in Russia, the nationalists who had these weird conspiracy theories. And they thought that, and their slogan was, first the US came after the Warsaw Pact, then it came after the Soviet Union, and now it's coming after Russia. And that's what they thought was happening, that this military alliance was moving forces up to its borders with the intention of taking over Russia. And we would, that was not true, and we dismissed that, and we had no intention of that, but that's how it looked to Russia. And Putin himself said, this is why he said the collapse of the Soviet Union was the worst disaster in the 20th century. That's quite a statement given what happened in the 20th century, but that's what he said, because he thought this had now left Russia defenseless. And he was determined to keep Russia strong, not just with its own military and nuclear weapons, but to rebuild the alliance network. And so this is what he's after. And he said this in his speech, basically, that he wants to see a series of buffer states or neutral states aligned with Russia in the sphere of influence. So not just Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine, but also to neutralize or win over some of the Eastern European states that are already part of NATO, which makes this whole thing so threatening to us.
So let me ask you, so we have a couple of questions. So one is from Gary. He says, what's the rationale for not supplying Ukraine with tactical nuclear weapons?
Yeah, well, the rationale is there's at least two big ones. And one, I just had a discussion with a reporter from The Intercept who was asking me in what she thought was a contradiction in my view. If I thought the nuclear risk was so large, why do I favor arming the Ukrainians? Won't that make it more likely that Putin will be defeated and thus increase the risk of nuclear use? Yes, it does. So, and so you have to do this very carefully, and you have to take compensatory measures on the other side to reduce nuclear risk. For example, just as an aside, the Biden administration, I think, is handling this very well. They have not responded to Putin's threats with a tit for tat threat, the way Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un got into that in the very scary months of the 2017, when we looked like we might go to nuclear war with North Korea. They haven't done that. They just canceled an ICBM test that was scheduled to go off yesterday out of fear that this might be misinterpreted by Russia. So they're trying to calm things down. I hope they're doing other things. I hope that General Milley is reaching out to the head of the Russian general staff and communicating to him that we have no intent, the way he reached out to China in January of last year to indicate that we had no hostile intents towards China. So one big reason not to arm the Ukrainians is that it would provoke the conflict and might increase nuclear risks. The other, and Ted Carpenter of the Cato Institute just wrote a brief on this too, is that our experience with arming insurgencies or arming one side of a civil war has not gone very well. Look what happened when we armed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and we basically created or helped create not just the Taliban, but Al-Qaeda from that conflict. And the same in Syria. Weapons that we intended to give to Syrians to defend their country ended up going over to ISIS. So you're worried about that kind of spread. I understand that. I'm not sure we have proper mechanisms to control what happens to these weapons. I still think we should do it.
Okay, so we have two questions about ceasefire or peace deal. So one specific question is, in your mind, what should the role of the US be in negotiating a ceasefire or peace deal? Is there a role for the US?
Yes, but probably not the major role. So this is where you would really need some deft diplomacy. This is where Tony Blinken's going to earn his pay, right? And fortunately, you know these people, Philip. You know Tony and Wendy Sherman and the others at the State Department who are really top of the game there. You don't get much better than this. They're going to have to work very closely with our European allies and other countries like China, countries that are neutral in this, to try to create a diplomatic off-ramp for Putin and then to convince him to take it. Those are two different things. It's not clear what that would be. Tom Pickering has some ideas of what that would be like. Some envision a neutral Ukraine, or what sometimes some people call an armed neutrality, kind of on the Finnish model, how Finland straddled both blocs during the Cold War, or the Austria model. I don't know if that's acceptable to Zelensky at this point or the Ukrainian people, but that would be a possible outcome to this. And the US is not, Putin can't appear to be backing down to the United States.
Yeah.
Right? So you've got to find another country that could do it. Macron, that's the role he envisions for himself. That would be a good role for him. But increasingly, I think it's China is going to play a very important role in this. And it shows you, that even though you're opposed to many things China is doing, there are so many areas where you need to cooperate with China for the greater world good.
So yeah, I mean, there's just so many moving parts here, and a lot of this at this level is once you're committed, it's about saving face somehow and creating the space for that to happen. There's another question. What do you think about the breaking news on the limited ceasefire? Any impact? I mean, humanitarian-wise, it's good, but do you see that? Do you see that having an impact on how things go?
I'm just seeing this now in real time. Negotiators agree to temporary ceasefire in some areas for civilian evacuation. Excellent. Yes, very good. But you can see how this sort of aids both sides. And if you're moving civilians out of a city, that basically means that the Russian troops will then be able to come in. But yes, you want to see things like this. This is what Zelensky has been asking for. He wants a ceasefire, and he wants an armistice, and then he wants negotiations on Russian withdrawal. So, and this is where it gets so hard. I mean, I have people in my own family who don't really care about this kind of stuff much. They want to kill Putin. They want us to go in and just take him out. You can't do that. You have to find a face-saving way for Putin to end this war. And this can be the beginning of such a face-saving way. And certainly, just on a basic humanitarian level, you want to stop the shelling, the missile strikes that are killing innocent men, women, and children, and give them a chance to get to safety.
Okay. Let me see. What is the level of Russian nuclear readiness? Again, what is the risk in your mind of an accidental weapon launch?
Well. Here's my understanding of what Putin's order to bring nuclear forces into special combat readiness, it was a very strange phrase he used when he announced this on the first few days of the war. And he had been exercising nuclear capable weapons in the military exercises right before the invasion. So he's been thinking about this for a long time. It's unclear what that means, but here's what we think it means. Philip, you may know Pavel Podvik, who noted Russian analyst on this, one of the best people I know on this. He believes that what this means is that the Russian forces, nuclear forces, in a day-to-day basis are in what they call constant alert, but the communication system that allows for the transmission of orders to the launch officers is blocked from accepting a launch order. So it cannot transmit that launch order. It's a basic safety device, so you don't transmit an order by accident or miscalculation. And then what Putin has basically done is take the safety off the nuclear gun. He has now allowed that communication system to accept a launch order. And that raises the possibility of the very thing that it's designed to prevent, of in the heat of battle, there could be a miscalculation, a misunderstanding, an accident, and a launch order could be given and therefore executed. So you're worried. No, go ahead.
No, so here's the following question. I mean, and you should explain this. I mean, the concept of sole authority, right? The American president has sole authority. Does Putin have sole authority? And why don't you explain that and then go from there?
It's not clear. It's
not
clear. The U.S. president has sole authority, and this goes back many, many years, basically back to John F. Kennedy. And after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was during that period, he discovered that commanders in the field could order the launch of nuclear weapons, and he didn't want some captain getting us into World War III. So he said, okay, this is it. Only I can give the order. Only I can give it. And right now we have a situation where 24/7, the president of the United States is followed around by a military officer with this briefcase. And you often see this officer when Biden is boarding the plane or going to a meeting, and they're with him all the time. And that contains the launch codes and the launch options for a small strike, a large strike, all-out nuclear war, and the communication mechanism for communicating those launch orders. Only the president can do that. No one can countermand the order when it's given. It's not clear if Putin has the same authority, because there's 3 such briefcases, satchels, in Russia. One is with Putin, one is with the Minister of Defense, and one is with the general who's in charge of the general forces, the equivalent of our Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's not clear if all 3 of them have to agree on the launch. We just don't know. But it's quite possible that Putin could do this, or very quickly make the others follow his command. You saw how he treats his national security staff in that famous televised meeting right before the invasion. He has total dominance over them. It's hard to imagine one of them saying, no, I'm not going to agree to the launch order. He would probably be shot and replaced with somebody who would execute the order.
So here's a question that I was going to ask you relative to what people can do. So one question is, so how are European countries with nuclear weapons thinking about first use? What are they thinking? Do they have that same position? The heightened nuclear threat from Russia, and who outside Ukraine would Russia's nuclear target really be?
Thoughts? Good questions. Yes. Number one, NATO allies traditionally have resisted the idea of declaring no first use. In fact, for the reasons I just explained, they were fearful that a Russian invasion, well, a Soviet invasion, Warsaw Pact invasion, required our first use. Got it. But now it's 30 years later. Obviously, I mean, Putin can't successfully invade Ukraine. He's not going to be attacking a NATO force. Highly unlikely that he would try to invade Poland or even the Baltics under these conditions, knowing what would happen next. So we don't need nuclear weapons first, but psychologically, this is so important to the Europeans and, by the way, to the Japanese and the South Koreans. So when we were doing the nuclear posture review over these last few months, Biden on the campaign trail and as vice president had favored a no first use policy. He said, I can't imagine a circumstances where we would need to use a nuclear weapon first to start a nuclear war. He's right about that. But when you go talk to the allies about this, they balk. They don't want anything that weakens the connection between the United States and Europe. They want us committed absolutely to their defense, and they are increasingly worried about the U.S. withdrawal, but the reliability of the U.S. in the last 4 years under Trump has increased those anxieties, right? So they've resisted that entirely. Neither France nor the United Kingdom, each of those have about 250 weapons or so each. You can go to the Plowshares website, by the way, and see the nuclear map. Go to plowshares.org. You can get the nuclear map there on who's got what where. And they definitely have first use policies, and they don't want anything to do with this. So if we move towards that kind of posture, it's going to have to be accompanied by active, vigorous diplomacy with our allies and assurances that this doesn't mean we're any less committed, and demonstrable acts to demonstrate that commitment, including something I have long resisted but would accept under these circumstances, moving some U.S. troops back into NATO to give the European allies the assurances they need,
Right.
knowing that our allies are never sufficiently assured.
Yeah.
Their appetite for assurances is insatiable.
Right. But understandably so, given the prior 5 or 6 years. So one more question about, someone had a question about generally about U.S. nuclear Russian arsenal, which I think would be helpful for people. And you can, I'm sure this is not new. So they talk about the majority. They want to know are the majority of U.S. and Russian nuclear weapons 70s and 80s era? In other words, are they old? And what kind of upkeeping has been happening? And does age affect efficacy? Right. So reliability.
All the nuclear powers are constantly updating their weapons. So whether they're adding numerically to the arsenal or not, they are constantly modernizing their weapons. And so nuclear weapons are no different from fighters, planes, tanks. They're always buying. And of course, there are always people eager to sell you the latest model of these weapons. So no, they're all up to, even though we have, for example, B-52s that are older than the pilots flying them, for example, there was nothing from the original B-52 left on that plane. Everything has been replaced. The engines, the airframe, the electronics, the seats, everything is updated. It's not super modern, but it's modernized. Same with the Minuteman ICBMs that we have. They get, engines get swapped out, the fuselage gets redone, the warheads are modernized, the guidance systems are modernized. So the weapons themselves are constantly being updated. Still, at some point they do wear out, and that's when you need to have a full replacement. So we are now in the third wave of nuclear modernization. The original nuclear arsenal was created in the Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson administration, our first Polaris subs, the first Minutemen missiles, the first bombers, et cetera. That was replaced during the 80s by first Jimmy Carter and then Ronald Reagan, a new set of ICBMs, a new class of subs, new bombers, B-1 and then B-2. Those have now reached the end of their operational life. So you're seeing we're well underway, building a whole new class of nuclear armed submarines, the Columbia class. We're going to have 12 of those fielded. Donald Trump, in the last few months of his administration, gave a contract to Northrop Grumman for a new ICBM, brand new long-range missile. That's going to cost us $264 billion. The Air Force is building a new bomber, the B-21, classified budget. I don't know what I don't know what's going to cost, but the B-2 costs about $2 billion per plane. So I think the B-21's going to end up in that range. So all of this is moving. So that's the good news, you might think. They're all modern. The bad news is this is going to cost us $2 trillion. $2 trillion over the next 25 years or so. And these programs go through with hardly a ripple of protest. So the ICBM, for example, $264 billion. You don't hear big outcry about that in Congress, whereas parental leave, that would cost about $200 billion over the next 10 years, that's too expensive. That we can't have. But for the weapons themselves, the lobby is incredibly effective. At this point, it cannot be stopped absent a president saying stop. And at this point, Joe Biden appears not to be willing to do that. He doesn't want to do anything that would make him or the Democratic Party look weak. So he is basically going to let all these programs continue. At least that was his position before the war. I hope it might change after this war.
So Joe, let's talk about this finally, just really quickly, and then I got a couple more questions I want to get in from you.
Yeah, I'll be shorter in my answers.
Yeah, that's fine. Well, someone says they want you to be the next Secretary of Defense, but I won't say any more about that.
Well, I do look like Robert Gates. I just want to point that out.
That's true. That's true. So what can along the lines of what you just talked about with respect to the political will, what can everyday citizens do with regard to nuclear weapons or to Ukraine in general?
Oh, well, on Ukraine, that's easy. I mean, there are dozens of places you can go to materially contribute to humanitarian assistance to the Ukrainians. And, boy, they need it. That's absolutely true. The second thing I think is politically on Ukraine. I think this is a real united front moment. I mean, that's why I went on Newt Gingrich's podcast.
Yeah.
As I say, we disagree about many, many things. But this is a time for Americans across the political and ideological divides to come together to aid the Ukrainian people and to stop this war, and then to develop policies that make sure this never happens again. And on nuclear weapons, it's sort of the same thing. You basically you do this through two ways. Let your voices be heard. Letters to the editor. If you have a chance to write, to publish yourself, do that. I've been writing up a storm on this for the last few weeks, but more it's using the instruments of our representative democracy. Go tell your representatives what you want. Go tell the Speaker of the House, who's from San Francisco, who completely agrees with us on these issues, to act on her beliefs, to go do something about this, to prevent the contractors and the hawks from using this war to increase an already historically high military budget. We're already spending more on the Pentagon than we've spent at any year since World War II, more than during the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Reagan buildup. We are at historically high levels. And I'm telling you, there are people chomping at the bit to throw more money on that pile, and tell her that you want her to do something about the nuclear weapons that we have, and to develop more creative policies to prevent other countries from getting these weapons and reduce them. They will listen. They have to know that there's a market for this, that they will get rewarded for this kind of behavior, not punished. Way too many politicians are afraid of opposing a weapon, opposing a defense budget, especially during an international crisis, because they think they'll be politically punished for them. You have to convince them it's exactly the opposite.
So I just want to alert our listeners that we have on our website, worldaffairs.org, we have some suggestions of what people can do as well. Joe, let's talk two more questions, okay? And this is about future prognosticating. We're not going to hold you to it, but we just want to hear your thinking. So a couple things. One question is, what does the best case scenario for Putin look like in the event of losing a war? Okay, and it's kind of unclear, but if things go really badly for him. And the other thing that I think is part of this that we haven't talked about, and again, I don't know if you feel comfortable talking about this, but you mentioned at the outset the risk of, Putin's at risk in ways that, were not very clear. That's something that struck me when you talked to in your opening statement. How much of a risk is that, and what is the Russian domestic role to play, the domestic citizenship? That would be interesting for us to hear your take.
So Putin is at risk. You got to realize he is fighting a multi-front, multi-level war right now. All his previous wars, he has either had the Russian people behind him, maybe manipulated them into being behind the Chechen war, for example. A lot of rumors that it was Putin's forces that blew up that apartment building. That was the justification, the claim that was a terrorist attack by Chechen rebels, and then allowed him to go into Chechnya, which was, by the way, a Muslim area. So again, using the divides in Russia to target a minority and brutally slaughter them. But he's had the Russian people behind him. The Russian people are not behind him. Everything you hear coming out of Russia is this took the Russian people completely by surprise, including the Russian troops. We've had Russian troops who have surrendered to Ukrainians, who telling the Ukrainians, we had no idea we were going to. We thought we were on maneuvers. We didn't know we were actually going to invade Ukraine. They didn't even know where they were when they were captured by this. It caught the Russian intelligentsia by surprise. It caught the military forces by command, the command forces by surprise. They didn't think this was going to happen. So he is very vulnerable right now, both by the failure of his military operations so far in in Ukraine, by the amazing economic pressures being brought to bear on him, which could bring down the entire Russian economy, and by the incredible resistance of the Russian people. It might just be a third, if the polls are right, a third of the people oppose this war, and the others are either for or neutral to it. But that third is being very loud. Thousands of Russians have been arrested. I don't know about you, but I would not want to be arrested in Russia. I would not go to a protest against the war. I would not want to be thrown into Putin's prisons at this point. But thousands of Russians are doing that, and it appears to be growing. It appears to be growing. So this is very risky for Putin. So what's his way out? Well, the best case scenario for Putin, and I don't know if he can get this. I don't know if the Ukrainians will agree to it, but it's a policy where he agrees to withdraw from Ukraine, and that Ukraine pledges to be neutral, so not join the EU, not join NATO. And the argument is, look, the resistance that the Ukrainians themselves have demonstrated should be their best guarantee of a repeat of this invasion. But then Ukraine has to give up some of its territory. They have to recognize the seizure of Crimea, and they probably have to recognize the autonomy, at least, maybe the independence of these two areas in the Donbass regions. That's a bitter pill to swallow. I don't know. I don't know if the Ukrainians would agree to that. But you do that, and you've basically achieved what people assumed were Putin's goals at the beginning. We basically thought that's what he wanted. It appears that he wanted much more than that, but maybe he'd be willing to settle for that. Can you get the Ukrainians to agree to that? I just don't know.
Okay, one last quick question to push in here. So about 1 minute. What are the two key takeaways you want our audience to take from our conversation today?
We are at a dramatic moment in world history. What the other end of this war is going to look very different than what the world looked like a week ago. And we don't know what that's going to be yet. But I tell you what, we're going to have a chance at the end of this war, a brief policy window, where we'll be able to re-examining the policies of the last 20 or 30 years, re-examine the policies of the last 20, 30 years to understand what we could have done better. What could we have changed to prevent this invasion from happening in the first place? What could we have changed to prevent these nuclear risks from being so high? And then we'll have another chance. We'll have a do-over. Can we do better? If Putin falls, that's going to be a whole new period for the Russian people, the Russian nation. We've got to do better in our relations with Russia than we did in the 1990s and the early 2000s. If there's a retreat and Putin stays in power, we have to immediately start talking about new measures to reduce their nuclear weapons, to develop new nuclear doctrines that are both in Russia's interests and our interests and the interests of the world as a whole. It's going to be a brief window because we're going to be moving on to the next thing much quicker than you can imagine, but it's going to be there and we have to be ready for it. So discussions like this are very vital to bring us all up to speed, to get us all thinking about this and getting us all ready to participate in this new policy debate. Because if we don't participate, the forces of the status quo will quickly assert themselves and it'll be back to the same old policies. And I'm afraid the same old policy failures.
So Joe, you've talked about some of the things that we at World Affairs can help with and facilitate with. Thanks so much for taking the time. Joe Cirincione, distinguished scholar from the Quincy Institute and a noted foreign national security expert. I wanted to thank all of you for in our audience for joining us and taking the time to be with us on this pop-up program. I hope you found it useful. We have other Ukraine-related events going on. I know there's one that we're kind of partnering with the Commonwealth Club later. You can go to worldaffairs.org. And while you're there, check out our podcast, World Affairs. You can download that. We have some episodes that are very interesting and very insightful on Ukraine. So please look for them. You can get that on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. So with that, Joe, thanks so much. It's great to talk with you. Great to see you. Take care, and so appreciative of you taking the time to be with us.
My pleasure, Philip. It was great being with you. And thank you, Samara, for nominating me to be Secretary of Defense.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.